Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 14. In Module 14, I'll do a fairly quick and one-sided discussion of some of the politics and pragmatics of sex research. You'll read the Grove article that talks a little bit about Penisgate, and the Module 2 assignment asks you to think a little bit about defending sexuality research, and that research in particular. But I want to talk about three primary issues around the work that we do in the politics and pragmatics of sexuality research and any sort of sexuality practice in general. For many of us, we live in an amazing bubble. We may step outside of our bubble sometimes, but we're all here in this Widener bubble. Many of you probably surround yourself in a lovely sex-positive bubble with people who think a lot like you. But it's really, really important that we're able to speak to people and work with people who are outside of our bubble. We have to meet people where they are. We have to speak their language, even if we think that their language is offensive. We need to be able to find some balance between what we believe is the right way to think about things and the way that other people think about things. Some of us, I think, get into a really narrow position where we're then only able to preach to the choir because we find everybody else to be offensive, and we get angry when we speak to them, and we get defensive, and we are often not able to work with people who are outside of our bubble. So we have to speak their language, meet them where they're at, and we often have to justify our research and our practice outside of our bubbles, and explain the importance of our findings in a way that people outside of our bubbles can understand. So this is something I know that is emphasized in the program. It's emphasized at orientation, certainly, but it's something that I think is really, really important. This is something that's come up in practicums, that sometimes students go into a practicum and need to work with people who are in agencies, in settings that don't think about sexuality in the way that we do, in the incredibly complex and sex-positive and beautiful way that we do. And so those students get into those settings and find it really difficult to work with those people. And the people in those organizations then find it really difficult to work with those students because they feel like those students have such a strong agenda that they can't do any other kind of work. They can't speak the language of the people who are at that organization. And so this is going to be a really critical professional skill for you, to be able to speak other languages and meet people where they are, while at the same time realizing that we're trying to change that in some ways. We're trying to get people to think about sexuality in a more positive, comprehensive, rational sort of a way. So we have to find that balance between meeting them where they are and speaking their language, and trying to get people to think about sexuality differently. Obviously, there are a variety of political issues around doing sexuality research. We're often under political attack, as discussed in the article. And because of political attacks on sex research, it can be challenging to get funding to conduct sex research, particularly without relating sexuality research to public health issues like HIV, unintended pregnancy, etc. And so we're often in the position to defend that research and the use of funding to conduct that research. And that's one of the things that the module assignment asks you to do, to be able to defend doing research, particularly on penis size, which for a lot of people feels like somewhat frivolous research in light of everything else that's going on in the world. And so, again, we may have to learn to speak a variety of ideological languages and accept some diversity in opinions. We often talk about diversity in a lot of different ways, gender, sexuality, etc. But I think ideological diversity is something that we don't talk enough about. And so there are going to be people who are going to be much more conservative than you. And certainly we want to get them to be more liberal. That's a lot of what we think about in our own practices and in our own research. But that ideological diversity is really important to help push our own boundaries, to help us think differently, to help us understand how to relate our own work to people who have a variety of different opinions and ideas about the world. And one last component of this very, very brief discussion of the politics and pragmatics of sex research is about the logistics of sex research. Because we're carrying out sexuality research, it adds an additional layer of logistics to the research process. We have to think a little bit more about handling reactions to sexuality-related questions, handling reports of abuse and assault, which we talked about in the ethics module. And we have to get research through institutional review boards and any other people, organizational boards, things like that, who need to approve that research. And so while we may ask questions in particular ways, those questions have to be approved by other research boards. So in some of my experience, one of the questions that we asked in a survey was, have you ever fucked somebody without a condom? And that we felt like was important to use language that participants would relate to. And then the institutional review boards at some universities say you can't use that kind of language in a survey. So you have to think a little bit about finding that balance between what organizations and individuals will approve and think is acceptable, and what we need to ask in the ways that we need to ask it to get the information that we need to get. So we may have to change questions, adapt them a little bit to make people feel less uncomfortable. So again, that's a balancing act between what we need to know and what's considered acceptable to ask. And it's really important to work within these existing structures to conduct quality research. So we're often working within school settings, within clinic settings, and so we have to be able to work with them again and meet them where they're at to think about how to conduct the best kind of research that we can in the settings that we desperately need to conduct that research in. So I won't spend any more time talking about this. I think the article does a nice job. I think you guys are probably very aware of some of these issues. But I wanted to bring up a couple of the additional issues and talk about them a little bit in terms of the way that you might think about them. I think this is really important from a research methods perspective and also from a professional development perspective, just to have a reminder that we need to be able to speak other languages. So it's always good for us to get outside of our bubbles every now and then and try and talk about our work and talk about the things that we do and listen to the questions that people ask us and observe their responses, and think about how we can say things differently, how we can help people better understand what it is that we do and why that's so important. All right,